Thank you for those kind words. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I consider it a privilege to be invited again and to share my thoughts on this important subject of energy and the role of energy in our lives. Let me just simply begin the talk. I have a simple proposition to begin with. Energy is intricately linked to our quality of life and the sustainability of the environment that supports our livelihoods. Furthermore, I go on to argue that energy access is a fundamental enabler of human betterment. Achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals would not be possible without access to energy that is affordable. In my talk, I will touch upon three key themes. Energy and climate are certainly intertwined, but at its core, in my view, climate change is not an environmental problem. It is an energy technology transition problem. Global warming has been in gestation now for over 5 generations. The fix to reduce the threat of climate change will likely take at least 2 to 3 generations. What we need to do is come to grips with a unique problem, one that imposes burdens across generations. The financing of an intergenerational obligation requires a societal consensus that can be difficult to achieve, but we need to cultivate an appetite for the long view. We need to develop a low-carbon energy system, an ecosystem that's built on resilient pathways, and we must deliver on the promise of affordable energy for every global citizen. We have 2 key challenges that will be with us for the rest of this century. The threat of climate change, obvious, and the requirement to provide clean energy to every person on the earth for their needs. That there is an urgent need for a global transition to a low-carbon energy future is clearly evident. The world is getting hotter. Right-hand side of this top image shows that, and climate science confirms this view. What is less obvious and lacking the right level of policy response is how do we achieve the aspirational targets for reducing carbon emissions to reduce the threat of climate change when they collide with practical realities of politics. The lower image on this slide is a composite image. It's a NASA satellite image of the world at night, showing areas of light and darkness. A stark reminder of the disparity and inequity of those who have access to energy and those who don't. The persistence of energy poverty remains a serious stain on the narrative of a clean energy future. So, as we peer into the future of energy choices and develop clean energy solutions, we cannot remain indifferent to the needs of a vast proportion of humanity and leave them in the dark. The scientific conclusions that emerge from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, reports are about as pungent and conclusive as they can be. Compelling analysis and scientific data have been brought to bear on the emerging threats and the need to bend the curve from business as usual scenarios. The risk of floods, fires, tsunamis, melting ice caps, threatened ecosystems, large single events, all these kind of have had a numbing effect on our consciousness. Scientists have taken to the use of the megaphone, and it's not clear whether our leaders are moved to bold action yet. If a discussion of climate change based on scientific data and models of radiative forcing functions fall on deaf ears, perhaps art may have some resonance. So on the left-hand side of this picture, this is Gerhard Richter. This picture, I'll show you the next one in a moment. This is Gerhard Richter's, the German iconic artist, and his abstract painting of color stripes. It's just abstract art and actually has nothing to do with climate change. It'll cost you about a few €1,000 to get one. On the right-hand side now, this is an image in essence similar to the abstract painting, but it throws the grim reality of climate change that mirrors that art. Let me explain to you in the next slides. Each stripe in this image is the average temperature for that year over 150 years. Generations, let's say. The first one, this is the one that I'm showing you now, is the global average annual temperature for each year, and this color scale represents the change over time. This is the United States, that's Switzerland, that's Germany, city of Vienna, Toronto, different locations in the United Kingdom where they've been measuring these things for some years. However you look at this, globally, at the country level, city level, village, and so on, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that global warming is for real. Now, I showed this to my 3-year-old grandson and said to Sam, all right, on the left, it is cold and blue. On the right, it is hot and red. Look at these pictures and tell me what's on the right side. And his reply was hot and red. These images have been developed by Ed Hawkins. What's sad is that some of our political leaders yet, particularly the one to the south of our border, do not seem to recognize a pattern that a 3-year-old kind of gets it without any difficulty whatsoever. The evidence is rock solid, and we don't need to debate climate change models. Let me now turn to energy. And I actually summarize a vast amount of information in these two numbers, so I'll take it slowly. Of today's global energy consumption, 85% of it is fossil fuels. The share of global energy, 85% is fossil fuels, and 15% is non-fossil fuels, essentially hydro, wind and solar, nuclear, bioenergy, and so on. This is the total global energy consumption. The total energy demand, and I'm going to convert it into different units, but just keep this in mind, is also 15 terawatts. Today we consume 15 terawatt years. One can convert that into 500 exajoules of energy. That is the global primary energy consumption today, 15 terawatts. And by 2050, 2060, that doubles. That requirement for new energy based on population growth and shifts in income and shifts in demographics means that we will now have to produce yet another 15 terawatts of new energy within the next 3 to 4 decades. In practical terms, what that means is that you're literally recreating the current global energy system infrastructure in 3 to 4 decades. Now, if we are going to meet the target of the 2 degrees C for the global warming, that shift cannot remain. 85-15 fossil fuels has to go down to become something else. And to get to a 50-50 share of fossil fuels and other sources of energy, all new demand would therefore have to be non-carbon, non-fossil fuel sources of energy. So just begin to think in terms of the scale of challenge that poses, that you are going to replicate today's energy system over the next 3 or 4 decades with non-carbon sources of energy. Just give you some perspective. Again, darker colors on the right-hand side of the slide means trouble. To reduce the risk of extreme weather events or maintaining the integrity of the environmental ecosystem, we need to bend that curve. That means to reduce emissions on a large scale in the order of something like 8 billion tons of carbon reduction per year. Now you might ask, what is a gigaton or a billion ton of carbon? Just to help you understand, that would be the equivalent of shutting down about 500,000 megawatt coal power plants, and you'll get 1 gigaton of reduction in carbon emissions. That's not a trivial proposition either. When I say global energy demand will go up and will double, what drives it? Of course, population growth, demographic shifts, and changes in the income profile of different countries in the world. So if we succeed at global development by helping people to lead better lives, we will have to deliver more energy. Energy challenge, therefore, becomes bigger with economic development and less poverty. So as you look to 2050 and beyond, energy demand either doubles or triples. It's a massive increase in energy demand. What's the story? Decade after decade, we see no let-up whatsoever in the upward trajectory of emissions, with almost 3 decades of negotiations now and discussions under the United Nations framework for climate change from Rio to Copenhagen to Paris. The impact on emissions has been minimal. Our scientific understanding of the threat of climate change has deepened and improved substantially. Our ability to reduce emissions has not. The share of fossil fuels in our energy system remains stubbornly stuck at the 1990 level, and this is a dispiriting story. Fossil fuels continue to dominate our energy system. Now, our role as Canadians in terms of our carbon footprint at the per person, per capita level is really nearly at the top end of the bar charts here. Not an enviable position, and nor does it square up with our aspirations to be good global citizens. Here you see the IPCC pull the emergency brake. We do need to reduce emissions almost by half and very quickly by 2050 or so. Fairly clear, global energy transition is certainly needed, but how? Emissions continue to go up, fossil fuels remain entrenched in our supply mix, and cheap fossil fuels continue to undermine other options. Our political processes rely on diplomacy, but diplomacy is severely constrained by what I call a zero-sum game strategy, meaning I can win only if you lose. This needs a shake-up and some collective acceptance of responsibility to future generations. And the obligations to future generations is, of course, to leave them a world that is not only culturally rich, but environmentally sustainable. We do need to come to grips with timescales. Why change is difficult in spite of good intentions, and what levers are available to speed things up. To meet global, this slide shows electricity demand, generating capacity will need to double over the next 30-year period, 30 or 40s of that order. The energy demand will double. And on this picture, somewhere from 3,500 gigawatts to 7,000 gigawatts. And if you do nothing, this would see carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector only nearly double over that time period. Now, what if all new coal-fired power plants were replaced by nuclear or wind or solar or geothermal or bioenergy, non-carbon sources of energy? Would that be sufficient for the power sector emissions to decline? At best, we could stabilize emissions from the power sector with these sorts of technologies. But because of the long lifespan, the intrinsic nature of the infrastructure and the lifetime that exists in this infrastructure, the plant facilities have a legacy that go over a long time period. So the ability to cause a reduction or a bend in the curve takes a little while because of the existing legacy system that's in place. Similarly, take our personal cars. They represent about half of the transport sector's carbon dioxide emissions. And if you replace them by zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, let's call it, and even if we have large scale deployment of these vehicles in the very near future that emit no carbon dioxide, almost at the rate of 20% annual growth rate if you wish, the emissions start to come down much later. The effects of the cleaner green cars bend the curve only slowly. So the idea that the existing infrastructure actually has a dead weight that allows you not to shift this curve as fast as you would like. In simple terms, what is built today, once built, creates a technological lock-in. The capital stock of the energy system has a long life, anywhere from 10 to 40, 50, 60 years. So huge inertia is built into the existing capital stock, and building new facilities takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and to retire the useful life of current assets will take anywhere from 20 to 50 years. So how fast we can change the basic structure of our energy system depends on, in essence, the rate of technological change. Here I show the history of energy transitions as we moved from, this is over 100 years, from 1870 on, 150 years. We moved from wood, which is the green part of this curve, to coal, which is the gray part of this transition, to oil, which is blue, to natural gas, that's red. Wood, the green shaded area here, supplied about 80% of the energy around 1870 or so, and it took about 100 years for its share to decline from 80% to below 10%. So the dominance of fossil fuels today, coal, oil, gas combined, red, blue, and dark gray in this picture, combined give us a share of the essential 85% fossil fuels in our current system of the energy mix, well, at least around 1970. So as you look to the next 100 years to get us to fossil fuel use at less than 10% of the share is the kind of time scales we got to begin to think in terms of. Now, from a climate perspective, that would be hugely problematic, certainly for our children. So we need to really think in terms of solutions. Are we going to be able to meet the global challenge that I've just described on a time scale that has urgency flashing in red? To get to something useful, we have to ask the big question. What future do we want? And then work backwards to identify technologies that can bring about transformative change. It will have to be some combination of disruptive innovation, changes on a global level and a time scale that's fully synchronized with the level of threat. We have developed here at Waterloo, in partnership with the Perimeter Institute, a roadmap for what I call the low carbon electricity ecosystem, and if this particular report and work interests you further, it is downloadable at our website or Perimeter Institute. So this is essentially a roadmap that takes into account the scale of challenge in the energy and climate space and offers one way of thinking through the reality of our existing high energy civilization and how that transition can be achieved with select transformative technologies. And the four core elements of a low carbon electricity system that includes a large role for wind and solar with large scale storage as part of the equation, but also advanced geothermal and nuclear. Now that's on the supply side of the equation. Smart urbanization, what I call zero carbon net positive energy buildings, and you may have read in the Globe and Mail that our offices now are located in the Evolve 1 building on the North Campus at Waterloo, is the first net positive energy building, zero carbon energy building in Canada, and it's been certified to be so. And on the last two coldest days last week, Our building was nice and toasty and cozy with geothermal energy. The rest of the University of Waterloo campus was actually suffering because they couldn't keep up with the supply of natural gas, but different story. So, moving to smart urbanization, net zero energy buildings is becoming a reality. Electrification of transport is just around the corner now, and you're beginning to see some impact. The role of digital technologies and off-grid electrification for distant and dispersed and disadvantaged communities. That's another part of the story here. So several positive developments are either here or in the near horizon. Now, let me turn to the question of universal energy access and why it matters. This is a picture of the global distribution of energy poverty and inequality. Some 2.6 billion people today have no access to clean cooking fuels and electricity. And of that 2.6 billion, 1.3 billion actually have no access to any level of electricity supply at all. So the consequence of this inequality about as clear and disturbing as they're staggering. So I'll give you but one example. Health consequences. The total number of deaths, annual deaths, every year, directly related to household indoor air pollution exceeds or is in the order of 4 million plus. These are World Health Organization statistics. This is an unacknowledged silent killer on a global scale that exceeds the number of deaths from malaria, AIDS, and TB combined. That this tragic story or tale continues to maintain its grip, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and developing Asia and parts of Latin America, is essentially a matter of record. Well documented, well rehearsed, but below the level of our collective consciousness for action. So, if we do nothing, by 2050, just about as large a proportion of humanity, approximately a third, will be without affordable electricity and clean cooking fuels. And it's not simply a question of proportion of people with on or with or without energy access. A number higher than 5 billion actually suffer from energy deficient services that perpetuates the vicious cycle of poverty. The affordability and reliability of energy services has a direct impact on all these factors: productivity of labor, national income, population health status, education, and social development. So, energy's link to life quality is about as compelling as it is clear, and here I've tried to show a metric easy to remember, and it provides a useful anchor. Annual GDP or income per capita per person on the left-hand side of this picture, or at least on the axis. Annual kilowatt hours per consumption of electricity on the right-hand side of the picture. So at the bottom of this ladder is what we call what lack of energy access delivers. A quality of life that really is an offense to our scientific and technical capacity to deliver. So at an annual energy level consumption below 100 kilowatt hours per person and income levels less than $100 equivalent per capita, life is just simply short, brutish, and nasty. And Hans Gosling, an eminent Swedish demographer, summarized this problem rather well, and I'm using his words now. That 1.5 billion people in this world have a light bulb and a washing machine. The next 4 billion only have a light bulb, and the bottom 1.5 billion have neither, none of it. So the message here is we need clean energy to manage the climate problem, and we need affordable energy for human betterment. Let me share a story which will bring home the point I'm trying to make. And this is a story told by Dr. Laura Stackel. She's a medical practitioner from Berkeley, California, had gone to West Africa to study medical practice in a rural environment. And as she tells it, imagine you are one of the 15 million pregnant women who suffer a complication during childbirth. You're poor, you've been trying for 2 days to have the baby at home, and something is not right, your family struggles to get you to a medical facility. You arrive at the hospital after an arduous journey, and at the maternity ward, what do we have? This is the only light that's available. And once it's determined that further intervention is required, a doctor is required to perform surgery, what do we have? You have an operating room at night that's in dark. Why? There's no light? Because the generator isn't working. There's a power shortage. And it looks like this. What is otherwise a routine medical procedure in our world anywhere, birth of a child, now is a near life and death situation. And what are the outcomes? Surgeries conducted under conditions like this translate into maternal or child mortality in the 50 to 70% range. Your outcomes are not good. Lack of reliability renders the entire medical infrastructure built at a relatively high cost completely ineffective. This is a clear example of the adage, for the want of a nail, the kingdom is lost kind of proposition. And what would it take to take this operating room into this? The solar suitcase, developed by Dr. Laura Stackel and her engineer husband, established through a not-for-profit organization called We Care Solar. This delivers the light in the darkest, the most difficult parts of the world, particularly in Africa, to reach, at a level of quality of an operating theater in Toronto or in Waterloo. And that's the solar suitcase. That's the innovation. It's a flexible, rugged platform designed to provide reliable direct current electricity for any kind of environment when access to power is critical or unavailable. It comes with everything you need to provide instantaneous power right out of a box, suitcase, and provides medical light all night long. The solar suitcase also includes a fetal Doppler, allowing health providers to detect heart patterns and so on. And what's the problem here? The only problem is that this thing costs about $2,500. That's 5 times the per GDP income of a person in that part of the world. It is simply delivered in terms of there's a solar panel, high-performance LED light bulbs, and so on. So we have to ask ourselves a question here in terms of what is the challenge. Can the cost be reduced by a factor of 10? Not 5% or 10%, but an order of magnitude. Can we improve the solar panel efficiency by a large margin to improve the battery densities by another large margin? What can innovation deliver that is a step change that would make this elegant solution scalable, affordable, widely available? Again, an image to point out the immense intrinsic value of energy and light and how quickly lack of energy turns into a dismal quality of life. This is the true tragedy of energy poverty. The burden of fuel wood gathering and water collection falls disproportionately on women and young girls, consuming in excess of 6 to 8 hours per day to support a family's cooking and heating needs. Time, the most important asset available to each one of us in our lives. And here it is, taken up, practically stolen in the struggle to meet daily needs. So, a lack of access to quality energy, in essence, shuts down the prospects of potential for education, social development, cultural development, economic productivity. Energy access, of course, has great potential to become a liberating force for change. And in my view, energy is an effective medium for the exchange for limited human time. Power for all, but not for me, is what this says. Our economic calculus of energy generation and distribution cannot remain indifferent to the needs of so many. So close, but so far. And this is where decentralized energy systems offer a cost-effective pathway out of energy poverty. A simple point to make then is time is the most precious commodity for each one of us in our lives. The drudgery involved in gathering energy for sustenance is simply theft of time and robs the individual of the opportunity for a better quality of life. Human labor is a very poor substitute for power generation. A small amount of energy, the magical convergence of what I call ICT or information communication technologies with the right device, now provides this gentleman on the right-hand side with access to the world's entire knowledge base. This Maasai gentleman can actually tell you what's the best sushi restaurant in Waterloo using that device. Now, it has taken 2 centuries of scientific developments and technological innovations across a whole range of disciplines to change our lives for the better. The second law of thermodynamics prescribes how much useful energy you can extract out of raw fuel. Michael Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction, combined with Maxwell's equations, laid the foundations for the benefit of this Maasai herdsman. What he holds in his hand is a smartphone and access to knowledge. So electricity is ordered energy, and ordered energy is magic. It has extremely high value in enabling fundamental transformative change. Energy access then is at the core of any strategy to deliver a better quality of life. This is the UN Sustainable Development Goals constitute a roadmap and a rational construct to deliver on the lofty goals of global well-being for every global citizen. The existing electricity infrastructure, the world we live in, delivers highly reliable service from centralized large-scale power plants connected to the power grid. This is the transmission and distribution system at a relatively low unit cost of energy. And this would be the tier 5 on the right-hand side of this picture. But the economies of scale for serving large populations are not the same as those for meeting the needs of energy poor who live in remote and dispersed communities distant from the existing grid. And we have problems in Canada as well with respect to our remote communities and how we deliver energy there. The cost of extending the power grid to the rural poor in Africa, Latin America, and Asia have been so prohibitive that the most convenient fallback position for politicians has been essentially take no action. So for a sensible pathway out of energy poverty, we have to think in terms of tiers of energy access from 0 to 1 and upwards to help break down the size of the problem. We need to get smarter, develop a more nuanced understanding of the various levels of need, and target development of solutions that can provide the necessary steps for a march up the energy ladder. So begin at the beginning, some light, solar lanterns, peak out power needs, solar suitcase in that little hospital. You begin to get at the picture that that's at the lowest end of the energy need. And then to home systems. And this is a wonderful example. I'm showing you a drone there. If you're trying to build energy systems, solar home energy systems in Africa, not only that electricity infrastructure doesn't exist, but the transport infrastructure is pretty pathetic. So delivering solar panels by drones is actually being considered as part of a business case, and companies are working on doing that. So this is innovation that's very interesting. And then, of course, you want to connect communities via microgrids, add on the power of what I talked about, digital technologies, and we are into another world. Then connect them for efficiency and further cost reductions. So these are light up the minds. This is using solar projectors for education. There are companies like Boond, Mobisol, and others moving from ideas of non-profit organizations to what we call social enterprise. That's gradually for profit, but in order to become sustainable, provide a level of sustainable energy services. Now, this is a project, Hitch. At WISE, we saw the promise of Hitch, and we provided early support, both technical and some financial. Globally, over 4 billion people do not have sustainable broadband that's available, affordable, and accessible. Hitch is a smart wireless mesh router software platform that pre-downloads relevant online content, so many users can access the same information quickly without an internet connection. Most of these users are not served by the existing coverage of the existing infrastructure in these countries. And the Flexinity, which is part of Hitch, has developed a smart wireless router that now allows schools to be able to use the content curriculum to be delivered via internet through this system. And this was founded here in Waterloo, is now being tested out in Nigeria, and is almost at the breakthrough of commercial operation. So that's a nice story to have one of our students pick up the cudgels and get on with and do something useful for others. Now, there is also a nexus between energy and food and water and pathways to self-sufficiency. So I just point out one example to you. You would think irrigation shouldn't be a problem for 30 million small farmers who live close to the river Ganges. This happens to be in India, eastern India. But today, most farmers have to choose between cultivating a single crop each year during the monsoon rains and then spending 90% of their profits to hire diesel or kerosene pumps during the dry season to access the shallow water that's just a meter or two beneath the ground. Most spots stay uncultivated because farmers cannot afford. They move to the cities and then leave their families for months at a time. Now, it's a wonderful, inspiring example here. This is Katie Taylor, student at MIT, with her co-founders at KethWorks, designed a centrifugal pump with 3 times the efficiency of a similar sized pump. And that meant it could be powered by 1/3 as much of energy required from a photovoltaic self-standing system, and which happens to be the most expensive part of that system. That reduced the cost, makes the system portable for farmers, can rent them out, sustain economic livelihood without having to abandon their homes. So another example of sort of an innovation that gives you some hope. Direct current solar panels for coolers, fridges, cookers. These things hold enormous promise as decentralized energy systems begin to take hold. And I give you just one or two more examples. I mean, this one on the camel is really thermodynamic voodoo, if I can pull it that way. Imagine getting a nice, I guess they won't drink a cold beer, but cold water in the desert directly from solar cells and so on. So this tells you the story in terms of various innovative innovations that hold some promise, part of the story, part of the narrative and I call them, anyone could have written this, but I call them my 10 design success for energy access, 10 commandments. So any solution has to meet at least 7 or 8 of these 10. Great if they can meet 10. It will be low cost, it has to be robust, durable, compact, easy to install, easy to transport. There should be modular, scalable, low-tech enterprise, low maintenance, limited additional infrastructure. If you can meet these sorts of tests, then you are on to a solution pathway that can break down the big problem. Many perspectives now converge on this idea, whether it is the International Energy Agency or the IPCC or global energy assessment. The need for radical action cannot be understated. This from the Global Energy Assessment, and I quote, that massive diffusion of new technologies for meeting thermal energy, motive power, and electricity needs is required to meet the grand challenge of improving energy access. This requires innovation on both technological and institutional levels. providing universal energy access to electricity is not just a moral imperative, it delivers substantial social, health, and environmental benefits. This is quoted from the Global Energy Assessment. So, the coming energy revolution, who will deliver? I don't think so. I think it will be led by scientists, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Let me talk a little bit about smart urbanization, another plank or path part of that picture I had shown earlier. So let's look at the promise of smart urbanization. Cities today are already at the heart of our electrical world, and the world is now undergoing the largest transition in history. You may have read figures today, more than half of the world, 7 billion people live in urban areas, and this is slated to go to 60-65% in the next 15-20 years. Smart grids, therefore, for managing the flows of electricity in our cities is part of the answer. And by taking advantage of the information and communication technologies, which I just showed you for one part of the world, has also that similar promise for our part of the world. Much can be done to reduce emissions and improve lifestyles if we can exploit the challenges of. Transportation contributes about 40% of humanity's global greenhouse gas emissions, currently a problem only likely to get worse as the cities. So this is relatively obvious. The emerging innovations, if we can solve the first inch and the last inch problem, or the first meter and the last meter problem, let's call it, service that is offered door to door at the same or better level of comfort and cost, our desire to own cars that are not utilized 95% of the time would go down. If you think about your car, it's only utilized 5% of the time. It sits in your parking lot or in your office parking lot, and that's about it. ICT, so now you've seen the Ubers and the Lyfts and so on, has the potential to break down our love affair with the ownership of assets, and on the way reduce our personal environmental footprints. So we want access to services, not necessarily ownership of the assets. And this is a picture that we've developed at our institute. I call it smart urbanization that drives smart energy networks. And I won't waste your time with the circles and the linkages, but all I want to say is that the left-hand side of the picture is all about information flow in smart energy networks, advanced technologies and systems that use information from different sources to make better decisions. How much energy to use, when to use it, where to use it, what do you tap, and so on. So this is consumers and businesses getting the energy they need as efficiently as possible. Energy flow, which is the right side of the picture here, is the physical energy system. If you now can integrate the information flows with the physical energy systems, there is fundamental new economic value to be created and to make lives better for a lot of people. And there are several reasons to believe that the ground is actually shifting from underneath our feet. And this is the latest US Department of Energy report that pointedly observes that the future has arrived for 5 energy technologies, all driven by dramatic declines in the cost of key energy technologies. LED light bulbs 95%, distributed photovoltaics by 55%, utility scale PV by 60%, wind by 40%, and so on. And so there are other developments at the doorstep as well: sensors, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and so on. This is some evidence to show that these costs have declined dramatically in terms of solar and battery prices and so forth. And what is even more dramatic is that the information and communication technologies, these are the sensors and devices and their performance improvements, are not 10% or 50%. They're 3 orders of magnitude higher, factor of 1,000 up improvements in cost or declines in cost or improvement in performance. So when these things become that cheap and integrated into our physical networks, that's where the promise is. So I don't think anyone here is looking to go out and buy the black telephone. You remember we used to shout at each other saying, "Hello, can you listen to me?" We still don't listen to each other with the smartphones, but that's a different story. But this is the notion of the transition that has already occurred, and it's in your hands. I will give you a couple of really neat examples to just finish this part of the talk. This is a close to home example here. This is in Vaughan, Ontario, so just not too far from here. It's real, 20 homes. So the homes have a solar roof and a battery. Well, you might say, okay, that's so interesting, anyone can have that. But what this was truly unique about this particular pilot, 20 homes, is that they're fully connected to each other and the grid, and you have intelligent algorithms that determine. So imagine Peter's house, they're consuming more at that any 1 minute, and Susan's house, there is a lot of storage in the battery, and so you're able to actually integrate that and feed power back to the grid at times when it's valuable to do so, draw power from it, either from your neighbors and or the grid, depending on the price differentials and so on. And each of these households are actually getting $400 to $450 per quarter reduction in their electricity costs, not because you just had a solar panel and a battery, but because you were interconnected. And that was ICT. That is the intelligent algorithms that have to completely new value created out of nothing, if you wish. And this is Ontario here, and it's ongoing, that project. This is the Sonnen Smart Community in Germany, not just a neighborhood, but all over the country. So there is a Sonnen flat box that literally connects thousands of users and combines many individuals' home storage, which is really a giant pool of batteries. So this virtual storage is large enough to buffer vast amounts of energy and thereby help stabilize the public power grid. And you actually, home consumers get a rebate back from the transmission authority for providing frequency control for the 30 seconds that it's required. But it's integrated across all cities in Germany, about 250,000 customers. It's a real example here. And so begin to think in terms of your home becoming a power plant, really. And similarly, your car becoming a power station. So power stations on wheels now. You can have an electric vehicle, fine. You can absorb power at low cost times. But if you're able to feed power back to the grid and integrate it with other cars, that's where the magic begins to happen. And this is an example that was run by Dwight Willett at Delaware University, highly successful, and proves the point that vehicle-to-grid technologies can. And if that was 5 years ago, now here is the real thing. This Nissan Leaf, just 6 weeks ago, has been qualified by the German transmission system operator as a power plant. And these cars are going to be in the market this June, I'm told. So there you go. Now, this is early going, but you get the point. And the car above, by the way, actually doesn't connect to anything. It itself absorbs solar energy directly and runs its battery on the energy that it absorbs. It's a solar car that charges by itself. It doesn't need to be plugged into anything. And that's in the Netherlands, again in the market by September. But that's what... So this is my way of... We will leave the autonomous vehicle discussion later. I can come back to this. But this is University of Waterloo. These cars are on the road. We're testing them without any passengers in this car. So transmission or transport as a service, battery as a service, these charging stations now assume a different perspective in terms of how we operate our system and so forth. You remember I told you energy transitions take a long time, and it's disheartening to say how all these things will change. But this is a picture looking at Fifth Avenue, New York, 1900. The picture is borrowed, taken from the Library of Congress. And nothing but horse buggies, right? There's no car there in the year 1900. Now, only 12, 13 years later, there are no horses left. They're gone, and all but cars, right? So, within 10 or 12 years, something happened. And the cars were more expensive than the horses and the buggies. But something happened. Now, you can imagine what. And so I just only provocatively say, okay, no EVs yet, or maybe one you can find on the 401 today. Can we see in another 12 or 13 years no gasoline cars? I will stop there and then pick up the latter part of these slides, a few things to discuss, and I think this is a reasonable point to break. So thank you. So So this is a picture I showed to you earlier, and the point I'm trying to make is that we have to take, it's not a linear approach to one solution for one problem, that it is an ecosystem view, that there is a connectedness between different elements of the energy system, and we have to see how these things get integrated and how we can actually solve this large problem. So I've touched upon the off-grid access, the provision of energy to the poorest in the world and the distant and the dispersed. And I've talked about the other side of the equation, which I call it smart urbanization, and some promise in that area. Let me touch upon again, it's from the same picture. So we look at how else might you actually generate that's low carbon source of energy and in plentiful supply. That's the key, global scale, not just another small pilot project here or there. And I would like to say that we look very closely at this pathway called enhanced geothermal. Now think of enhanced geothermal energy as a proposition that turns the oil and gas drilling business on its head. Over 100-odd years now, globally, we have established a very sophisticated scientific and technical capacity. This is all done by the oil and gas sector to dig deep holes, and the industry is capable of doing so profitably. Now, instead of continuing to search for unconventional resources of oil and gas, and they've done that every time you run short somewhere, they go to the deep oceans and so on, in remote locations. Would it not be equally credible to mine geothermal heat instead of carbon molecules? And what I'm talking about here is enhanced, this is deep geothermal power. Now that is ubiquitous. There is no Saudi Arabia of geothermal energy. If you dig a hole 5-7 kilometers deep, the heat of the planet Earth at the core is enough to provide sufficient base load, non-carbon source of energy to any country. This is a different proposition than other geothermal energy options that you may have heard about, which are dependent on geography, some in Iceland and Indonesia and Japan and so on. But I'm talking of deep geothermal energy. So that is an energy, low carbon energy on a large scale. If it could be tapped for electricity production, the heat at the center of our planet offers an inexhaustible supply. And so we can focus on this particular technology as one. Every technology comes with a certain set of challenges and problems. Microseismicity is one of them. But geothermal is promising in the sense that it's a closed loop cycle. Yes, you need some water, but it's not very demanding on the water required to extract the energy. It's just a closed loop cycle to be able to generate the energy. And again, I don't have a great deal of time to go into details of each one of these, but that's a thought I wanted to plant in your mind. The geothermal is one, and it's real. This is the German Center for Geoscience Research near Potsdam. Deep drilling here. It's packed with innovation. This thing can drill down 5 kilometers, 7 kilometers, powerful drills. They drill about 100 meters a day into the rock. There are other such facilities in Finland, and other countries are exploring. Australia has made it national priority to look into geothermal energy as a resource and so on. Canada is now shifting ground. We've been pushing our government a fair bit to think. So you may have heard in Saskatchewan, $25 million project geothermal. It's not deep geothermal, but it's a geothermal project that was announced 3-4 weeks ago. So geothermal is part of the equation, can be part of the equation for a decarbonized energy system. Now let me quickly move to another. Now this is a ticklish subject and has been controversial on many fronts, but the potential for nuclear power, now I'm talking of advanced nuclear power. Current generation technologies are getting safer, and one can have debates about it. But advanced nuclear generation is a low carbon source of energy that cannot be overlooked. And you may have also heard Bill Gates talk about this recently, that he's beginning to argue that if we're going to solve the climate change problem, nuclear ought to be part of the equation, and maybe not the only answer, part of the equation. This pathway here, advanced nuclear, that I talk about in this report, lays out the steps for further exploring how it can be part of our electrical future. And I'll show you one or two images to just make a simple point around the benefits and the importance of it. So now you can literally say, we have nuclear waste, right? And we talk about how we're going to solve that problem. Well, if that can be turned into fuel, recycle that nuclear waste, close the fuel cycle, then and do it in an inherently safe way. And that is decarbonized baseload power, essentially for the next 1,000 years, if that's what you want. So that this particular cycle dramatically reduces the nuclear waste, which has been a problem, or at least in how we manage and ultimately dispose of it. So burning that existing waste from old reactors to generate energy. Now, doesn't that sound sensible? We are prepared to recycle just about any other waste. Why not nuclear waste and a powerful source of energy? But as you know, public acceptance of nuclear has been challenging. But this is all documented in the report, and so this is on the left-hand side here is the once through cycle, as it's called. This is how we actually, in every country, wherever nuclear power is generated, you are essentially using 5% of the energy that's in the fuel, and then the rest is waste. If you got to full recycling via the integral fast reactors, that reduces the waste to less than 1% and 99% energy utilization. Why would you not do that? So this transition to advanced nuclear offers, again, the potential of an inexhaustible non-carbon source of energy on a terawatt scale. I'm again not talking just concepts. There are countries moving down this path, not unfortunately in the OECD countries, but the locus of nuclear development along these lines has moved to Russia, China, India, South Korea, and so on. What we do here at Waterloo really is fundamental science and research, but with a focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. What can science and technological innovation do to change the equation in a way that makes energy affordable to the people who have very little?
We've got almost 300 remote and northern communities across northern Canada, and about 170 of those are First Nations communities. The electricity can end up costing close to $1 a kilowatt hour for these remote communities. So it is very expensive, and in some cases not even available.
How we can help is with two types of technologies. The first is renewable. And by renewable, we might mean solar or wind. The second technology is batteries, storage, energy storage.
It's really critical to be able to store renewable energy, ideally from solar power or perhaps from wind power, in affordable systems to allow for, in affordable batteries, to allow for load leveling and also for storage at night or even off-season storage.
There is actually a wonderful graphic that I often show, which is the image of the world at night. And you can see those areas of darkness and those areas of light. And it's very indicative of really those who have access and those who don't, and in fact how this drives a whole range of energy policy issues.
Being Waterloo, we're implementers, right? We like to say, let's make things work better.
So the technology is now coming in to place, which allows us to put a panel on the roof, put storage, put efficient lighting, and you have the ability to transform lives.
We believe that we have come a long way. So we are providing leadership within Ontario, and we are basically leading some of the major efforts, and we're coming up with new ideas that were not there before.
Yes, scientific and technological innovations, but a whole host of other things have to come into play, particularly entrepreneurs and people who will take these solutions and scale them up and bring them into the context of the lives of the people as they live it. To give you a perspective and a sense of what we do, And this Affordable Energy for Humanity initiative is a consortium we put together. It's all part of the Waterloo Institute of Sustainable Energy. And we're on a path to creating anywhere from 300 plus signature projects, ICT enabled, to delve deeply into all aspects of the challenges of energy access at every tier level. And the simple proposition is we've got to get the costs down, and we've got to get the performance levels improved by orders of magnitude if we're going to break the back of this rather difficult problem of energy access. We put together a consortium with the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, but our partners are also a number of the leading universities around the world, Harvard, Oxford, Berkeley, Arizona State University, and others. And we've now put together a group of 170 odd leading thought leaders and researchers in 50 institutions, 35 countries. And we're at it. So this is a passion, a mission that we're on to, and we could use all the help we can get from anyone who thinks that this is a process worth supporting. So universal energy access to meet the test of climate change plus human betterment, can it be done? Our goals and objectives are clear and simple. We want energy services to be affordable, so energy poverty can be relegated to a footnote of history. We, of course, want to be judged by future generations that we took a positive approach to the challenge of global environment and meeting the needs of those who have nothing. So that's all integrated into the UN Sustainable Development Goals that you have seen. And as I've said, that energy remains critical to that. Somebody may ask, well, what's all this going to cost? Is this really achievable? The UN Sustainable Development Goals and the International Energy Agency has put together a number of scenarios. The types of cost estimates that you're looking at globally, according to the International Energy Agency, and this is over a 20-year time frame, is in the order of $69 trillion. Your heart might sink and you say, where do we get that kind of money globally now? And this is over 20 years. But I will just give you one more slide to say this is from the US, from actually the handbook of CIA handbook. The total amount of cash sitting in all the bank accounts globally on December 31st, 2017, at a point in time now, $99 trillion, earning 0.0% interest rate. So, if you argue that we do not have the global capital to solve a global problem, I think you might need to convince me that too many hands are in there wanting a higher rate of return, and that's where the money is not accessible. So, that's a simple point I make, but this is a point of discussion, of course. So I'm coming to my last few slides and observations to the end of this presentation, but to re-emphasize that the guideposts that will shape the future directions of tackling both the energy problem and the climate, the scale and complexity of change suggests it will take some time to get to a low carbon energy. There is an equally compelling global need for a non-carbon based source of high quality energy. By high quality energy, I mean electricity. The global dimensions of energy poverty is an even larger and deeper social and economic problem, and that radical improvements, by that I mean almost improvements, orders of magnitude improvement in reduction of cost, improvement of performance, next generation materials, nanomaterials, and so on, have to be part of the equation to get us to some sort of an optimistic future. So, paths to a sustainable energy future must be clean, of course, affordable, and accessible. And we all know that it's a jigsaw puzzle that has many components and many parts that we have to find a way somehow to make them fit. And since I'm a magician, we will do so. It's that simple, right? these are all the components of, I may have missed a few, but all the essential components of both the energy system and the climate space challenge that we need to be able to put together so that we can get to a future that makes some sense. But while we do that, I think we should also not forget that sustainability also involves adding a little bit of beauty in our lives. So we don't want to be just confined to boring technological solutions that doesn't introduce some beauty. We're working with the Land Art Generator Initiative out of Seattle, wonderful group. What they're trying to do is create inspirational prototypes of works of art in communities that become both sources of economic development and are fantastic things to see, but based on renewable energy. So this is the solar hourglass. I think it's in Dubai. This is another one that captures the wind. They actually generate some physical energy, but that's not their intent. You can't make a justification for that investment in that facility, but they are a draw. They become sources of tourism and so forth. And here is another energy duck that actually generates energy, but is in Copenhagen. This was the Copenhagen competition and so on. So this is my sort of positive way of saying, okay, let me not have depressed you about the big challenge of global energy systems, but we should do that. We are able to do so, and we should do that with a little bit of introducing a little beauty in our lives through artistic creations like that. And that brings me to the end of my talk. And I'm more than happy to now just get myself organized and take out your questions and begin to answer your questions, if that's fair enough. Is that how we proceed? Okay, so I think this is a question from someone, Balsili, I presume is referring to Jim Balsili, said on the agenda last night that our government does not support innovative companies. We are far behind other countries. Why? Then there's a sort of, I'll get to that, but a related question as well. Innovation, no mention of government. What role is for government in supporting change? So the kind of related questions, I'll get to that in a second. Just make sure I got the issues around innovation and role of government and what they should play as part of the. Okay, let me touch on those and give you my perspective on those two questions. I know what I think I know what Balsili is up to, and he has said this often. I have a lot of respect for him in many ways, and he's much focused on the idea of the role of government in supporting innovation, but there's also a perspective that he brings around intellectual property protection and how we find a way to ensure that the great ideas that come out of universities and the young people and so on, that there isn't sufficient support both from the government and private sector capital to give them the legs up to be able to become unicorns or large companies that can actually stand on their own in the global competitive marketplace. And so in essence, I think he is making a correct observation that capital in Canada, financial capital in Canada is essentially risk averse compared to the United States, Singapore, Finland, even Israel, and a few other leading countries that are quite focused on innovation as the pathway to survival of those societies and creating economic value. We are a little stodgy in that matter. It's not that our students and we as Canadians don't have good ideas, or we're abundant. We actually have a very thriving innovation ecosystem here in Waterloo, as you know. But the pull to get to the global level is not there, and I think Balsili's complaint is that the government is not active enough to provide the kind of support that other governments do to call them young entrepreneurs and innovators, and the kind of support that enable them to become truly global scale successful companies that of course create new wealth and so on. So we hear a lot in terms of in every new government with its speech from the throne always pays homage to innovation, and the words are there, but when it comes to practice, I think he's on to a correct observation that it's not as firm, not as strong commitment, not as disciplined as we might do compare ourselves to other countries. Let me just give you one example. Singapore is a fantastic example. Singapore city-state, as you know, small country, really nothing in the way of resources. Singapore in late 60s became a country from the colonial era. Malaysia and Singapore split. Singapore becomes a country. Not much of a standard of living. 5 decades later, here is a country that has its per capita GDP is at par with Canada, UK, US, or any of these countries. How did a country like that, with no oil, no gas, no land, no resources, nothing, essentially turn into a first world country? Use of your brains, right? That was so very disciplined government support, and in a way that is so disciplined that they create a whole new economic value. So Singapore a few years ago, 7-8 years ago, decided that they wanted to be in the field of biotechnology. They wanted to be leaders in biotechnology. What did they do? They said, fine, we have no biotechnology expertise in Singapore. We're going to spend $1 billion, and we're going to send out our smart young students, 1,000 of them, to the best universities around the world, and they picked the universities, and they created such a powerful drive so these students would study, learn from the best minds around the world, and they gave them the incentives to come back and become professors and set up labs. And so the entire is thinking through on a big scale in a committed way that puts anchors in place. Other countries have tried to replicate the Singapore model along those lines. Brazil is one, Mexico is trying, and so on. We don't have anything like that. We are hit and miss, off we go. So we do not have the kind of disciplined support to support the innovation that Jim is talking about here. Let me touch on one or two other questions. Fantastic questions, by the way. Okay, so somebody said, again on the subject, referring to perhaps a few of the images I showed of technological innovations, and says, these are fantastic, but how do you handle social disruption like that to the Trans Mountain pipeline? Again, if you think nuclear is a ticklish subject, that's even much more problematic. I work with a number of energy executives and people in government policy and so on, and often the observations senior colleagues who make are very pertinent and very. He says, you know, the sort of work we do at the universities, both here at Waterloo and other universities, good high quality stuff, etc. But what we're lacking is the engagement of our social scientists and our colleagues in the faculties of humanities and arts to the engagement of the sorts of challenges we talked about in my talk. And so they say, what are you doing about it? And I have a self-effacing, half-assed answer, if you wish. Yes and no, but it is true that the strength that our colleagues in the faculties of social science bring to the table in terms of shaping of the narrative, the debates around energy issues, the complexity of Trans Mountain pipeline approvals, these are fundamental social, political problems, and what is the framework and mechanism that can draw people into a consensus kind of building as opposed to a diverse approach, is all matters of issues that social scientists are most capable of providing insights into, and they're absent. They're not I'm making a harsh statement, absent. They're not as fully engaged as I would like them to be. So that's a true observation. And so the kind of disruption that we are seeing on Trans Mountain Pipeline is, of course, rooted in deep aspects of Canadian history and our First Nations folks and challenges around siting of any new infrastructure but to develop social acceptability for the planning, design, building of energy infrastructure, or for that matter any other infrastructure, we need to take our perspectives and narratives a step above from my interest versus your interest, that we need to develop consensus somehow in a much better way. That takes to the, how can we change the political will to get involved with climate change? This is a bit of a sad story. In one of the slides, I could have stopped and gone on when I said emissions have continued to increase. We've had so many meetings of the Conference of Parties, however many plans since the 1990s, the Green Plan and the Red Plan and any other plan that every government, including Mr. Chrétien, who committed to us to the Kyoto Protocol, and then subsequently undone by the Harper government, and so on. So we've seen over 2 decades, 2.5 decades, essentially plans and no action. Emissions have not gone up, right? And now we have a government that is struggling with respect to the carbon tax versus cap and trade, a debate that you see that will surface in the elections that come up. But this is what I would say to you, or I tell my students. I said, we have a job to do, meaning whether it's professors or students or collectively as individuals in our community, to give our politicians a little bit of a slack, right? We cannot insist at all times or fall into the trap of what I might call a political ideology that says no tax ever, not 1 cent of tax out of my pocket for anything, that the only place money is worth is back in my pocket and no tax. You cannot build a societal consensus around common good, common interests, unless we're prepared to say taxes are there for some good. What would you do without taxes that furnish your hospitals and our streets and our quality of life? As Warren Buffett said, he has no problems paying for tax. He says, that's how I buy civilization. So and if you want a no-tax society, I think you should take a visit to Somalia and you'll find out what that does. I'm being a little flippant, but this narrative over the last 3 decades, from Maggie Thatcher onwards has embedded in our political system a perspective that says taxes are a bad thing, and therefore we get handcuffed. I think there's a related question: how are you going to solve the climate change? How are you going to finance it? And I actually have written, in fact, I'm on a podcast tomorrow at Balsillie at the school on that. So there's one on divestment. But what is the answer to creating a pool of capital that can solve the kind of problem I'm talking about, that it's intergenerational, it's difficult, so one of the arguments I've developed in a paper is like this. The current fault in the carbon tax and the cap and trade regime, one can argue, favors one or the other and its effectiveness, and both are essentially not as effective as I would like them to be, although carbon tax would be better than cap and trade. The problem with a carbon tax is, because of the politics, no government can increase the tax to a point where it's painful. So it's low enough that it's useless, doesn't achieve anything, and if you raise it high enough, you got social revolution. So you saw the yellow vests in France, you targeted the diesel drivers, you put a tax on them, and the next thing you know, you just about undid a government. Okay, so so there's the fundamental flaw in the academic community, the IPCC, all the economic assessments we have done, we have not provided the politicians and the policymakers with a clear enough pathway that recognizes the political realities and mechanisms for raising financing beyond the simplistic measures of a cap and trade versus carbon tax. And I've now articulated this along these lines, that, and I will throw it out to you, take the GST back up to the 2 percentage points that Mr. Harper brought down. No one likes GST, we know that. But economists will tell you that tax on consumption has no impact on economic growth. So that's the one good thing. Number two, that would generate something in the order of $20 billion a year if you take 5% back up to 7%. And no one likes to increase the tax, I accept that. If you do that, first it's equitable, in the sense that you're not picking on the diesel driver or somebody who's bringing in your banana from Mexico or whatever else in the system. We all bear it. And to the extent that the socially disadvantaged folks in our society are, we give them GST rebates. So there's a whole mechanism in play to be able to deal with the equity part of a consumption tax. Now if you have that $20-odd billion flowing into the government pockets every year, all of you have this complete suspicion that the government is just going, this money is going to go down the rabbit hole, right? If we have innovation in governance that would allow that money to be sequestered and invested in the future decarbonization strategies, working with industry to say, you're looking for low-cost capital, gentlemen? Here is a pool of capital, here are the incentives. As Canada, we've decided we're going to decrease our carbon footprint over the next number of decades. So there's some stability, predictability in how we're going to go about doing this. There are funds, and 20 billion goes to 21 billion the next year. So there's large amount of capital that begins to accrete inside this kind of a sequester. And you would have to have an act of parliament, to say hands-off government. This will be managed by boards such as the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. There's not one person in this room who would say any contribution you ever made to the Canada Pension Plan was wrongly done. It is the gold standard for investment in this world. So we can create social infrastructures and institutions that can manage vast sums of money with a clear objective. If that's going to be for decarbonization, why not do it that way? It is but an example, and it is an analogy, and it has to be worked through with some rigor. But what that does is it takes it off the plate of every government, center, left, right, doesn't matter, reversing the other government's decisions. And that takes us to an open discussion in the political realm to say, as Canadians, do we accept that we have an environmental problem, and are we prepared to do something about it? And a 2% increase in your consumption tax is not going to kill you. In fact, you get the point. So you need to have innovation in governance, an act of parliament, a way to deal with this. Why? Because it's a long-term problem. It cuts across generations. It is just, if I can contribute from my consumption today, I'll make sure our grandchildren will have a better future. That's the idea. Okay? So it can be done. Norway has sequestered a large amount of money. It's $1 trillion in its fund to look after days when there will be no more oil from Norway. Alberta and Norway, if they were countries, you compared them, were at par from 1970s on in terms of the amount of oil produced, amount of revenues generated. What did we do in Alberta? Got nothing to show for it. What did Norway do? You got $1.5 trillion amount of fund to look after their future, done through an act of parliament. So one can manage institutions properly if you put your mind to it. That's my answer to the question, a very long-winded answer, but and that takes me to another very interesting point, since we're on money and how do we deal with it, the question of divestment of the oil and fossil fuels. There's a movement underway right now where people are saying we need to get out of fossil fuels, and it's gathering storm. I think there's an even more powerful parallel development And I think that will have more impact than divestment, although I'm in principle not against the divestment, individuals who are trying to push that way. But let me tell you a parallel and a more interesting, that will be most effective, and it's actually already having some serious impact. And there we have to thank none other than one of our own, Mr. Mark Carney, our Governor Bank of England, but Governor Bank of Canada years ago. Now, he's of course therefore a man of enormous influence. He's chair of the Financial Stability Board. Michael Bloomberg is the vice chair of the Financial Stability Board. Carney was the first person, I think he's done more for climate change than just about any UN politician and Paris Accord and anything else to have a real impact. He gave a speech in front of Lloyd's September, October of 2015, a couple of years ago, where he laid down the basic argument for every corporate board needs to understand its financial, what is your liability to carbon? Okay, so if a board member asks the management, what is the risk of, this is what's called the risk of carbon bubble. It's no longer a question of the resources of oil, gas and coal that you have in the ground. If you're British Petroleum or any one of these big companies, and you say on your financial statements, these are your assets, that when you take them out, it's certain value. Now those assets, anyway, if that carbon doesn't come out because of the global regime that's evolving, then it hits the valuation of the stock of that company right in the nose. So all sorts of companies have now become very tuned in to what we call transition risk, or it's a report by the Bank of England under its Prudential Regulation Authority that they issued a year after, where they spell out these issues and constraints, and is now taking hold. The Dutch central bank has come up with the same. What it is a challenge to the corporate entities to understand its liabilities in terms of carbon risk, and are they vulnerable to that? So you might think, oh, okay, these are governors of banks, central banks, what influence do they have? Blackrock Investment. Anyone heard of Blackrock Investment? It's the largest investment of assets in the world. And if you look at the financial disclosure requirements of BlackRock and what they will want to invest in, is really beginning to change the equation in terms of people's understanding. So follow the money and begin to understand the potential risk for further investment in carbon infrastructure and carbon facilities, and you will may come to the conclusion to say that the world will change in front of us, and very fast, and before you know it, it'll become the standard approach to doing things. So these are sorts of the developments in play right now. How you raise the money, whether you divest, whether you understand the challenge of carbon liability, and that will, I think, influence decisions of where you invest, how it is invested, and may have a far greater impact than some professors saying climate is a problem and we need to do so, right? So I think that if you have patience, I might go through a few more questions. Let's see. Somebody indicate to me how much time I have. Oh, we're pretty well close. Maybe last question, 5 minutes? Okay. See if there's anything I can pick up here. Okay, what's the future for nuclear power in a low carbon environment? I think I kind of half dealt with it in the presentation. I'm very surprised that China was below US and Canada. This was on the carbon footprint. It's on a per capita basis, that is true. If you take the aggregate Chinese emissions, is quite large, but because there's 1.5 billion of them, so that's why. But what point it makes is we may be only 35 million, but look at our carbon footprint, the amount that we put out into the atmosphere, not so good. Where will the money come from, what to do, what is required? So I showed you a rather neat slide which says 99 trillion is sitting in banks doing nothing, but that's just this is a whimsical way of saying it. How can we change the political will to get involved with climate change? I think look, I'm only a professor. Come on. how can Canada be a better global energy citizen? And I think this is the point I've been trying to make. Yes, energy is important. Energy is important to our quality of life, that of the other people as well. And we need to advance energy solutions, innovative solutions. We have we are a rich country. We have the capacity of both intellectual capacity and monetary capacity to lead the world in clean tech. And so it's by doing by example is really where we will shift the political ground. And I was in Alberta giving a similar talk and got challenged by obviously the fossil fuel executives who said, yeah, Professor, what are you talking about? And it is true, you know, the Alberta is hurting as a province. It's difficult in the short term, you know, current economic. So one cannot be indifferent to the difficulties of somebody in the short term. But the point I made was, where do you think the oil industry started in Canada? Anyone here? It was here in Ontario, Petrolia. You remember? 1857. 100 years later, is there an oil industry in Ontario? We moved on. We did other things, right? So is it reasonable to believe that the next 100 years Alberta will still be digging tar sands? Maybe, maybe not. We may have moved on to something else. So it requires imagination to be able to say, short term, yes, you need to figure out how to prevent the hurt for people who will be influenced, lose their jobs and other such things. But yes, we can become powerful ambassadors for being good energy citizens, global energy citizens by example, and we have the capacity in Canada to do so with creating and building a generation mix that's less dependent on fossil fuels. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah.